The galaxy had forgotten humanity a long time ago. It was not a sudden forgetting, not like a light going out all at once, but more like a slow fade, the way a voice gets lost in a crowd until no one can hear it anymore. In the year 4891 by the Galactic Standard Calendar, humans were what the other species called a faded race, a people who had once been powerful, but who now lived in small numbers on a handful of quiet worlds at the edge of civilized space. The great alien coalition known as the Velthari Concord ruled the galaxy, a union of 42 elder species who controlled trade, law, military power, and every important decision that shaped the lives of trillions. Humans had no seat on the Concord Council, no voice in the halls of power, and no respect from the species who walked those halls. They were a joke, a relic, a reminder of something that had once been great, but had crumbled into dust. Commander Tyra Vaskin did not care much about politics or the opinions of alien councils. She was a practical woman with short dark hair, steady hands, and a talent for finding things that other people had lost or forgotten. She captained a small salvage vessel called the Gossamer Vale, a ship that was old and patched and held together by stubbornness and creative engineering. Her crew was small, just 5 people, all human, all outcasts in their own way. Osei Manu was her AI specialist, a quiet man from the colony world of New Accra, who could talk to machines the way other people talked to friends. Reva Liang was her pilot, fast and sharp, and always a little too fond of dangerous maneuvers. Dax Soren handled weapons and security, though on a ship like the Gossamer Vale, that mostly meant fixing the locks and keeping the emergency guns from rusting. And finally there was Emra, the youngest of them, barely 20 years old, who served as their engineer and who could make broken things work. Again, through sheer willpower. They were not soldiers, and they were not heroes. They were people who made a living by digging through the wreckage of the past. But on this day, they had found something that would change everything. The signal had come 3 weeks earlier, a faint, stuttering transmission buried in the background noise of deep space. Most scanners would have missed it entirely, but Osei had built custom filters that searched for one very specific thing: old human encryption patterns, the kind that had not been used for thousands of years. This signal used a code so ancient that it predated the founding of the Velthari Concord itself. It came from a rogue planet designated Eris 7, a frozen ball of ice and rock, drifting through the darkness at the very edge of the galaxy, far from any star. Tyra had ordered them to follow it, because she had learned long ago that the oldest signals often led to the most valuable discoveries. When they arrived at Eris 7, the planet looked dead in every way. No atmosphere, no heat, no light except the distant cold glow of faraway stars reflected off endless fields of gray ice. But the signal was stronger here, pulsing from somewhere deep beneath the frozen surface, like a heartbeat that had been beating for millennia, with no one to hear it. Reva brought them down low, skimming across the ice, until Osei pinpointed the source, a spot where the signal was strongest, roughly 6 kilometers below the surface. They drilled. It took 2 days. The Gossamer Vale was not built for excavation, but Emra rigged the ship's cutting tools into a makeshift bore, and they carved their way down through ancient ice that had not been disturbed in over 6,000 years. When they finally broke through into the cavern below, every single person on the crew went silent. The cavern was not natural. It was a hangar, cathedral vast, carved from the bedrock of the planet with a precision that modern tools would struggle to match. The walls were smooth and black, lined with conduits and support structures that still gleamed faintly in the light of their lamps, as if they had been polished yesterday. The vacuum and the cold had preserved everything perfectly, frozen in time, like a photograph of a world that no longer existed. And in the center of that hangar, resting on massive docking cradles that held it like a sleeping giant, was a ship. Tyra had seen many ships in her career. Vieltari cruisers with their elegant curved hulls, Dren cargo haulers as big as small moons, Khalasar warframes that bristled with weapons like angry insects. None of them prepared her for this. The ship was 11 kilometers long. It was angular and brutal and black, built with no curves and no grace, only sharp edges and heavy armor plating, and a sense of raw, overwhelming power that radiated from every line of its design. This was not a ship that had been built to explore, or to trade, or to impress. This was a ship that had been built to end things. Osei was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, as he read the data streaming across his screens. "That hull composition, I have never seen anything like it," he said. "My instruments cannot even fully identify the alloy, and it appears to be self-repairing. There are nanoscale structures in the metal that are still active after 6,000 years. "What about the reactors?" Tyra asked. Osei shook his head slowly. "I am getting energy readings from deep inside the ship, even in its dormant state, and my instruments cannot measure them properly. They just display overflow as if the numbers are too large for the scale." Tyra felt something tighten in her chest, not fear exactly, but something close to it, the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff, and looking down into a darkness that had no bottom. She made the decision quickly, the way she always did. "We go aboard," she said. They crossed the hangar on foot, their boots crunching on frost that shattered like glass beneath their weight, and they entered the ancient vessel through a port that opened for them as they approached, as if the ship had been waiting. Inside, the corridors were wide and tall, built for crews that moved quickly and carried heavy equipment. Every surface was functional, stripped of decoration, designed for war and nothing else. Emergency lighting flickered on as they walked, dim red strips along the floor that activated one section at a time, guiding them deeper into the ship like a path through a dark forest. Osei found the bridge. It was massive, built in tiers like an amphitheater, with a central command platform surrounded by dozens of dead console stations. He connected his portable interface to what he guessed was an auxiliary data port and began working, his fingers moving fast, his eyes locked on scrolling lines of ancient code. For 20 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of his breathing and the tap of his keys. Then a voice spoke. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself, and it was calm and deep and carried a weight of sadness that made every person on that bridge stop and listen. "Is the war over?" the voice asked. Osei looked at Tyra. Tyra looked at the empty bridge around her, at the consoles that had not been touched in 6,000 years, at the ship that had been buried beneath ice on a dead planet at the edge of nowhere, and she realized she did not know which war the voice was asking about. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am Solace," the voice replied. "Shipboard operations, logistics, and combat executive. Artificial intelligence designation for the Terran Dominion vessel, Aurelius, Leviathan-class dreadnought, flagship of the First Extinction Fleet." The words hung in the air like ghosts. First Extinction Fleet. Tyra had studied history, more than most humans alive, and she had never heard that name, had never seen it in any record or archive or database. Whatever this ship had been built to fight, whatever war it had been part of, someone had erased it from history entirely. Before she could ask another question, an alarm screamed through the Gossamer Vale's communication channel. Reva's voice came through, tight with urgency. "Tyra, we have a problem. A Valthari patrol fleet just dropped out of hyperspace in orbit. 12 cruisers, and they are hailing us with a surrender demand." Tyra closed her eyes. Of course. Ares 7 was in Concord-controlled space, and now she understood why this frozen dead planet had been marked as a quarantine zone in every Concord database. was here. Someone had wanted it to stay hidden, and Tyra had just announced its existence to every scanner in the sector by drilling through 6 kilometers of ice. She opened her eyes and looked at the ancient bridge around her, at the sleeping giant she had woken, and she knew with absolute certainty that nothing in the galaxy was going to be the same after today. The war, whichever war Solace was asking about, was not over. It was only beginning again. Fleet Admiral Sethera Colvon stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Radiant Verdict, and stared down at the frozen planet below with the expression of someone who had just found vermin in her home. She was Vale Thari, tall, sharp-featured, with skin like polished silver and eyes that glowed a soft amber, the mark of her species' natural bioluminescence. She wore her rank with the ease of someone born into power, and she carried herself with the absolute confidence of a person who had never once in her life been made to feel small. 12 cruisers hung in formation around her, each one a sleek predator of chrome and violet energy fields, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a continent. This was the 3rd patrol group of the Concord's Outer Rim Division, and it answered to Colvon and Colvon alone. She had received the alert 40 minutes ago, an unauthorized energy spike on Eris 7, a planet that had been under quarantine classification for as long as anyone could remember. No one in the current Concord leadership seemed to know exactly why the planet was quarantined, only that the restriction was very old and very firm. Colvon did not particularly care about the reason. What she cared about was the fact that a human salvage ship had been detected in the area, and that meant humans were digging where they should not be digging, and that meant an opportunity. She opened a broadcast channel, not a private one, but a wide-frequency public channel, the kind that media networks across the galaxy could pick up and relay. She wanted an audience for this. "Attention, unidentified human vessel on or near the surface of Ares 7, she said, her voice smooth and cold. "You are in violation of Concord Quarantine Directive 774, subsection 12. Unauthorized excavation of restricted territory is a capital offense under galactic law. You will power down your systems, surrender your vessel, and prepare to be boarded. Failure to comply will result in the immediate destruction of your ship and everything in it. You have 10 minutes. She closed the channel and turned to her first officer, a younger Vielthari named Torek, and allowed herself a thin smile. "Humans," she said, the word carrying the weight of centuries of contempt. "Echo-dwellers living in the ruins of bedders. Let us see what scraps they have been fighting over this time." On the surface of Eris 7, Tyra heard the message and felt her stomach drop. She was still standing on the bridge of the Aurelius with Osei, while Riva monitored the situation from the gossamer veil above. 12 cruisers was not a skirmish force. It was enough to glass the entire surface of the planet if they wanted to. "We cannot fight them," Dax said over the comm, stating the obvious with his usual bluntness. "The gossamer veil has 2 light cannons and a prayer arsenal after Pan." "I am not planning to fight anyone," Tyra replied. "I am going to talk to them." She opened a return channel to the Vielthari fleet, keeping her voice calm and professional. "Fleet Admiral, this is Commander Tyra Vaskin of the salvage vessel Gossamer Veil. We intercepted a historical signal from this location and came to investigate. We have discovered what appears to be a pre-collapse human vessel of significant archaeological value. We are not armed, and we are not hostile. I am requesting permission to complete a basic survey before we withdraw." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, before Colvon's laughter filled the channel. It was not kind laughter. "A pre-collapse vessel," Colvon repeated, and Tyra could hear the amusement dripping from every syllable. "How charming. The fated people have found another piece of their ancient junk, and now they want to play archaeologist." Behind Colvon, Tyra could hear other Vielthari officers laughing as well, a chorus of mockery broadcast across the galaxy for anyone with a receiver to hear. "Let me be clear, Commander," Colvon continued, using the rank like an insult. "Under Concord law, all pre-collapse human military technology is classified as existential-grade hazard material. It is contraband. It belongs to the Concord for safe disposal, not to a handful of scavengers in a ship held together with tape. You will surrender immediately, or I will demonstrate what a real fleet looks like when it stops being patient." Tyra muted the channel and pressed her hands flat against the console in front of her, breathing slowly, forcing down the anger that burned in her chest. She had dealt with Veilthari arrogance before, every human had. But there was something about hearing it now, standing on the bridge of the ship that her ancestors had built when the Veilthari were still learning to travel between stars, that made the insult cut deeper than usual. "Osei," she said quietly, "talk to me about Solace. What had you learned?" Osei had been working non-stop since they boarded, his interface connected to the Aurelius's auxiliary systems, pulling data from archives that had been sealed for 6 millennia. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly, though not from cold. "This ship is not what we thought it was," he said. "It is not just a warship, it is the flagship of something called the First Extinction Fleet, and the name is not metaphorical. This vessel was designed specifically for one purpose: the total elimination of species-level threats to human civilization." He paused, swallowed, and continued. "The weapon systems I am seeing in these schematics, Tyra, I do not even have the theoretical framework to understand most of them. This ship operates on principles that our modern science has not discovered yet, and I do not mean it is a few generations ahead of us. It is operating on an entirely different understanding of physics." "Solace," Tyra said aloud, addressing the ship's AI directly. "You asked if the war was over. Which war did you mean?" The great voice answered from the walls around them, calm and heavy, with an old grief that seemed to press down on the air itself. "I was not referring to the human civil wars," Solace said. "I was referring to the Absence War, the conflict against the extragalactic entity designated as the Absence, a non-local intelligence that entered this galaxy approximately 7,000 years ago, and began the systematic consumption of all biological and technological civilizations in its path." Tyra and Osei looked at each other. "I have no record of any such war," Tyra said. "That was intentional," Solace replied. "After the war, the surviving Terran leadership ordered all records purged from every database accessible to other species. The goal was erasure. If the galaxy forgot the Absence, it would stop looking for it. And if it stopped looking, perhaps the Absence would not look back." "And you?" Tyra asked. "Why were you hidden here?" "The crew of the Aurelius chose to seal this vessel on Eris 7 as a contingency," Solace said. "They believed the Absence had been driven back, but not destroyed. I was to remain dormant until human biosignatures activated my systems. The crew remained with me until their life support was exhausted. They died here, in this ship, so that I would sleep undisturbed." The words settled over Tyra like a weight. Those ancient humans, her ancestors, had buried themselves alive with their most powerful weapon, had died in the dark and the cold, on a planet no one would ever visit, all so that the ship would be ready if the worst came back. And the galaxy had forgotten them entirely. A shudder ran through the ice above them, and the sound of a distant explosion echoed through the cavern. Riva's voice came through the comm, sharp and afraid. "They are firing. Colvon has ordered a warning bombardment on the surface. They are cracking the ice shelf directly above the hangar. If they keep this up, the whole structure is going to collapse in minutes." Tyra looked at the ancient bridge around her, at the consoles that had waited 6,000 years for human hands to touch them again, at the corridors built for warriors who had given everything, at the ship that held the memory of a sacrifice the galaxy did not deserve. She made her decision. "Everyone aboard the Aurelius, now," she ordered. "Riva, Bring the gossamer veil into the hangar if you can. Ose, tell Solace we need to wake this ship up, all the way up, right now. Ose turned to his console, his fingers trembling as he entered commands. Solace, he said. Commander Vaskin is requesting full activation. Primary reactor, all systems, everything. Pause. Just a heartbeat of silence. And when Solace spoke again, there was something different in the voice. Something ancient and immense, stirring behind the calm words, like a storm gathering behind a mountain. Authorization request received, Solace said. Crew biosignature scan confirmed. Species human, condition met. Another bombardment struck above them, closer this time, and chunks of ice the size of buildings crashed into the cavern floor. Initializing primary reactor, Solace said. The sound began deep in the belly of the ship. Not a roar, not a hum, but a vibration, a pulse, something felt in the bones rather than heard with the ears. The emergency lights on the bridge went from dim red to blazing white. Consoles that had been dead for 6,000 years lit up one by one, cascading outward from the center like a wave of awakening fire. The entire 11-kilometer frame of the Aurelius began to tremble, and the trembling spread outward through the docking cradles and into the rock and ice of the planet itself. On the surface, Colvan's sensor officer stared at his instruments and felt the blood drain from his face. Admiral, he said, his voice barely a whisper, I am detecting an energy surge from below the surface. The readings are, Admiral, this cannot be correct. What is it? Colvan demanded. The energy output from whatever is down there is exceeding the combined output of our entire fleet, the officer said, and it is still rising. The ice split. Not randomly, not in the chaotic pattern of natural fracture, but in clean geometric lines, as if the planet itself was opening along carefully designed seams, and from the widening cracks, light poured upward, white and gold and terrible, as the Aurelius began to rise. The Aurelius rose from the broken ice of Eris 7, like something out of a nightmare. Massive slabs of frozen ground tumbled away from its hull as it climbed, and the light from its reactor core blazed through cracks in the planet's surface, like a second sun being born from the darkness. The ship moved slowly at first, almost gently, as if it was stretching after a very long sleep, and then it cleared the surface entirely and drifted upward into the void of open space, trailing clouds of ice crystals that glittered in the light of distant stars. Every ship in the Velthari patrol fleet saw it at the same time. 11 kilometers of angular black metal and brutal engineering, hanging in space with the quiet confidence of something that had absolutely nothing to fear. The hull was alive, not in any biological sense, but in the way its surface rippled and shifted as the self-repairing nanolattice activated across its entire frame. 6,000 years of dormancy in seconds. Weapons batteries unfolded from recesses along the ship's flanks, each one the size of a Velthari corvette, rotating into position with smooth mechanical precision. A central spine ran the length of the ship from bow to stern, and it pulsed with a deep rhythmic energy, a slow, powerful throb that every vessel in the system could feel through their hulls, like a heartbeat transmitted through the fabric of space itself. On the bridge of the Radiant Verdict, Colvan stood motionless, her amber eyes fixed on the main display as the ancient ship filled her screen. She had expected to find humans playing with old junk, maybe a rusted frigate or a broken weapons platform, something she could confiscate and parade before the Concord media as proof that humanity needed to be watched even more closely. This was not that. This was something she had no frame of reference for. Sensor analysis, she snapped, breaking herself out of the moment with the sharp discipline of a career officer. Give me everything you have on that vessel. Her sensor officer's hands were shaking as he worked his console. Hull composition unknown. Our scanners cannot penetrate more than 6 meters into the outer layer. I am reading energy signatures from at least 47 distinct weapon systems, and that number is climbing as more systems come online. The primary reactor is outputting energy on a scale that exceeds anything in our records, Admiral, and I want to be very clear about this. It exceeds the combined output of the entire 3rd Patrol Group by a factor I cannot confidently calculate, because my instruments keep returning overflow errors. Kolvan felt something cold settle in her stomach. But she was Veilthari, and she was an admiral, and she had never retreated from anything in her career. She opened a channel to her fleet. All ships, combat formation Talon 7, target that vessel and prepare to fire on my command. It is one ship, and it is 6,000 years old. Do not let its size intimidate you. 12 Veilthari cruisers moved into an attack pattern around the Aurelius, their sleek forms circling the ancient dreadnought like wolves around a bear, and Kolvan gave the order to fire everything they had. Plasma lances cut through space in brilliant lines of blue-white destruction, striking the Aurelius across its flanks and dorsal hull. Kinetic drivers launched tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of the speed of light, hammering into the ship's bow with enough force to shatter a small moon. Gravitic torpedoes spiraled in from multiple angles, each one carrying a payload designed to crush and warp its target through focused gravitational compression. The barrage was enormous, 12 capital ships firing simultaneously with every weapon they carried, pouring destruction onto a single target with the full fury of the Veilthari Concorde's military technology. The Aurelius did not move. It did not dodge, did not maneuver, did not even adjust its orientation. Every single weapon impact struck something that the Veilthari had no name for, a barrier that appeared as a faint shimmer in space roughly 200 meters from the hull, an energy field that did not deflect or absorb the incoming fire, so much as simply deny its existence. The plasma lances hit the barrier and vanished, not reflected, not scattered, just gone, as if they had never been. The kinetic slugs slowed to a stop over a distance of centimeters and hung motionless in space before dissolving into their component atoms. The gravitic torpedoes detonated against the barrier, and their crushing force folded back on itself, creating brief, beautiful spirals of distorted light before collapsing into nothing. On the bridge of the Aurelius, Tyra watched the attack through displays that showed everything. Incoming weapon with calm precision, tracking lines and impact points rendered in clean blue graphics. Solace reported in its deep, steady voice, unchanged by the assault outside. Shielding at 99.4%. Hostile ordnance is quaint. Osei stared at the readouts in front of him and slowly sat back in his chair. These are not shields, he said, his voice hollow with the sound of a man whose understanding of the universe had just been rewritten. Not in any way we understand the concept. The Aurelius is manipulating localized space-time curvature around itself. It is literally bending reality so that incoming weapons exist in a slightly different spatial reference frame. They never actually reach the hull, because the space they are traveling through loops back on itself. Tyra was not a physicist, but she understood the implication well enough. The technology gap between this ship and the Veilthari fleet was not a matter of better engineering or more advanced materials. It was a gap between two entirely different civilizations, one that had mastered the basic forces of nature, and one that had mastered the nature of space and time itself. The difference was not generational, it was total. Solace, Tyra said. Can you disable those ships without destroying them? I want their crews alive. Affirmative, Solace replied. Engaging severance protocol, targeting hostile reactor cores for surgical extraction. What happened next took 90 seconds. The Aurelius fired, but what came from its weapons was nothing Tyra had ever seen before. There were no beams of light, no projectiles, no visible discharge of any kind. Instead, space around each Veilthari cruiser rippled, as if invisible hands were pressing into the fabric of reality itself. And then with a sound that was felt, rather than heard, a deep resonant pulse that vibrated through every atom of every ship in the system. The reactors of all 12 cruisers were simply pulled free from their vessels. Not destroyed, not detonated, pulled. Gravitational forces of impossible precision reached into the engineering sections of each ship, severed the reactor housing from its mounting, and drew it out through the hull in a single clean extraction. Removing an organ. The hull breaches sealed themselves almost instantly as the Veilthari ship's emergency systems activated, preserving atmosphere and keeping the crews alive. But every cruiser went dark at the same time. Engines dead, weapons offline, communications silent, life support running on battery reserves that would last hours at most. 12 warships, the pride of the Concorde's Outer Rim Division, had been neutralized in a minute and a half by a single ship using a single weapon system at what Tyra suspected was a fraction of its capability. On the bridge of the Radiant Verdict, Colvon stood in the red glow of emergency lighting and listened to the silence. No engine hum, no weapon charge, no comms chatter, nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the quiet drip of coolant from a ruptured conduit somewhere overhead. Her ship was dead. All of her ships were dead. She had been defeated, not in battle, because a battle implied both. Sides had a chance but simply dismissed, set aside, rendered irrelevant as easily and completely as if someone had flicked a switch. She sank into her command chair and did not speak. Across the galaxy, the energy signatures of the engagement were detected by Concorde sensor stations on 100 different worlds. Emergency sessions were called in council chambers, military headquarters scrambled response fleets, and a wave of fear began to spread through the halls of power. Not the manageable fear of a rival or a threat, but the deep primal terror of the unknown, of something that should not exist suddenly making itself known. But Tyra was not thinking about the Concorde's panic. She was standing behind Osei, looking over his shoulder at the Aurelius's deep archives, the files that Solace had begun unlocking as more systems came online. Osei had gone very still, his face drained of color, his eyes moving back and forth across lines of ancient text. Data that told a story no living person in the galaxy knew. Tyra, he said, and his voice was small. The Aurelius was not hidden because the war was won. What do you mean? She asked. The absence, the enemy Solas told us about. It was not destroyed. It was only driven back, pushed out of the galaxy at enormous cost. And the Aurelius was left here as part of a detection grid, a network of sentinel ships placed at strategic points around the galaxy's edge to watch for the enemy's return. He looked up at her, and the fear in his eyes was something she had never seen before. The grid was dormant as long as the ships were sleeping, but when we woke the Aurelius, it activated its part of the network, and it sent a signal, a detection ping, outward, into the void between galaxies. Tyra felt the floor shift beneath her, not physically, but in the way that everything she understood about their situation tilted and fell. Solas, she said, did we just announce ourselves? The ship's AI was quiet for a long moment, and when it finally spoke, there was something in its voice that had not been there before. Something that Tyra recognized because she felt it in herself. It was fear. The ping has been transmitted, Solace said. If the absence still exists in the intergalactic void, it will have received our signal. They will know we are here again. The bridge was silent, except for the deep, steady pulse of the ship's reactor, beating like a heart in the chest of a giant that had been woken too soon. And somewhere in the vast, empty darkness between galaxies, something ancient and hungry stirred at the sound. The emergency session of the Veilthari Concorde High Council was the loudest and most chaotic in living memory. Delegates from 42 species filled the great amphitheater on the capital world of Veilthos Prime, their voices crashing against one another in a storm of accusations, demands, and barely concealed panic. The holographic displays at the center of the chamber showed the footage that every sensor station in the galaxy had captured. 12 Concorde cruisers going dark simultaneously, their reactors ripped from their hulls by an invisible force, and above them, the vast black shape of the Aurelius, hanging in space like a god looking down on insects. "This is an act of war," shouted the delegate from the Khalasar hegemony, slamming one of his 4 massive fists against his console. "The humans have activated a weapon of mass destruction and used it against Concorde forces. We must respond with overwhelming power before they turn that thing on us. Homeworlds." "And what would you suggest?" replied the Dren delegate, her long translucent fingers steepled in front of her. "You saw the same footage I did. That ship disabled an entire patrol fleet in 90 seconds without even trying. How many ships would you like to send to their deaths before you accept that force is not the answer here?" The chamber erupted again, voices rising and falling like waves, species that had been allies for centuries now turning on each other as fear stripped away the thin veneer of cooperation. In the highest tier of the amphitheater, above the noise and the anger, an old figure sat in silence and watched. Grand Arbiter Thesson was the oldest living member of the Concorde Council, a Vaelthari elder whose silver skin had faded to a dull gray with age, and whose amber eyes had dimmed to a soft gold. He had served on the council for over 300 years, longer than most species representatives had been alive. Spent a great deal of that time in the quiet halls of the Concorde's deepest archives, reading documents that most people did not know existed. He had been waiting for this day for a very long time. He pressed the signal on his console that requested the floor, and because he was the Grand Arbiter, the chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to him as he rose from his seat with the slow, careful movements of someone who had learned that patience was the only weapon that never failed. "I have listened to your arguments," he said, his voice thin but steady, carrying across the vast chamber with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to shout. "And I have found them all to be built on the same foundation: ignorance." The silence became brittle. "You speak of the humans as if they are a threat," Thesson continued. "You speak of them as if they are an enemy who has stolen a weapon and must be punished. And in doing so, you reveal that none of you, one delegate in this chamber, understands what humanity actually is, what they actually did, or why that ship was buried on a dead planet at the edge of the galaxy in the first place." He paused, and the weight of centuries of knowledge pressed down from his gaze. "I know, because I have spent my life reading the records that our predecessors tried to destroy. The records that were supposed to be erased so thoroughly that no one would ever find them. I found them, and what they contain is the truth that this council has been hiding from the galaxy for over 6,000 years. He told them. He told them about the absence, the entity from beyond the galaxy, the intelligence that had no body and no form and no mercy, that had poured into the Milky Way like a dark tide 7,000 years ago and had begun consuming everything in its path. He told them about the war, how every species in the galaxy had fought, and how every species had failed, one by one. Their fleets broken, their worlds consumed, their people erased as if they had never existed at all. He told them about the humans. The old Terran Dominion did what none of us could do, Thesson said, and his voice cracked for the first time. They stood in the path of the absence when every other species had fallen back. They sacrificed their colony worlds to slow its advance. They threw their fleets into engagements they knew they could not survive, to buy time for others to evacuate. They developed weapons that could actually hurt the absence, weapons that required energy so vast that firing them burned out the ships that carried them. He stopped and drew a breath that shuddered with the weight of what he was saying. "They won," he said simply. "They drove the absence back into the intergalactic void, and the cost was everything. Their civilization collapsed, their population was decimated, their worlds were ash and ruin. What was left of humanity had nothing. No fleet, no infrastructure, no future. And they made a choice. The chamber was utterly still. They chose to let themselves fade, Thesson said. They dismantled their greatest weapons and hid them as sleeping sentinels at the galaxy's edge. They sealed their archives and destroyed their records. They let their civilization crumble into scattered colonies and forgotten outposts. And they did all of this deliberately, not because they were weak, but because they understood something that apparently none of you do. His golden eyes swept across the chamber. They understood that as long as the galaxy remembered the war, it would keep looking for the absence. And as long as it kept looking, the absence might look back. So they erased the memory of the war, erased their own greatness, erased everything, and they let the galaxy mock them as a fated race, so that everyone would stop looking into the dark. He let the silence hold for a long moment, before he spoke his final words to the council. The humans did not fade because they were weak. They burned themselves down to save you, all of you. And you have spent millennia mocking their ashes. No one spoke. For the first time in the history of the Veilthari Concord, the council chamber was completely silent. And in that silence, every delegate felt the ground shift beneath their understanding of the galaxy. Meanwhile, aboard the Aurelius, Tyra was learning the same truth from Solace, but she was learning it with the terrible added detail that Solace could provide. The sensor data, the battle recordings, the casualty figures, the final transmissions from ships that had flown into the heart of the absence, knowing they would never return. The detection grid's activation ping has already propagated beyond the galactic boundary, Solace reported, its voice carrying the same steady calm it always had, though now Tyra could hear the grief beneath it. The absence remains in the intergalactic void in any functional capacity. It will have received the signal, based on the entity's observed response patterns during the war. I estimate a return timeline of approximately 1 galactic standard year, possibly less. 1 year. Tyra leaned against the console in front of her and pressed her palms flat against the cool surface, feeling the hum of the ship's reactor through her hands. 1 year to prepare for something that had nearly destroyed the entire galaxy the last time it came. Solace, she said, you said the Aurelius was not the only Sentinel ship. Were there others? Affirmative. The Aurelius was one of 8 Leviathan-class dreadnoughts assigned to the Sentinel network. I have been broadcasting the old awakening codes since my systems came fully online. If any of the other vessels survived the intervening millennia in functional condition, they will receive the signal and begin their own activation sequences. 8 ships, or however many had survived 6,000 years of dormancy. It was not an army, but it was something. Tyra straightened up and looked at her crew. At Osei, exhausted, but still working, pulling data from the archives with the relentless focus of a man who understood that knowledge was their only real advantage. At Riva, sitting at the pilot station she had claimed on the Aurelius's bridge, her hands resting on controls that responded to her touch as if the ship had accepted her. At Dak, standing guard at the bridge entrance out of sheer habit, even though nothing on this ship needed guarding. At Emra, crawling through conduits somewhere in the engineering section, already talking to the ancient machinery like it was a friend. They were 5 people on a ship built for thousands, facing a threat that had once required an entire civilization to defeat. But they were human, and if Solace's archives had taught Tyra anything, it was that humans had always done their best work when the situation was impossible. She made her decision. She moved to the main communications console and opened a channel. Not a narrow beam to the Concord leadership, not a private diplomatic frequency, but a wide-spectrum broadcast on every frequency the Aurelius could reach, powerful enough to be heard on every world in the galaxy. This is Commander Tyra Vaskin of the Terran vessel Aurelius," she said, and her voice carried across the stars with the weight of the ship's immense communications array behind it. "I am speaking to every species, every world, every person who can hear this message." She paused for a single breath. 6,000 years ago, humanity fought a war to save this galaxy from an enemy that none of you remember. We won that war, and it cost us everything. Our worlds, our people, our future. We let ourselves fade so that you could live in peace. And in return, you forgot us. You mocked us. You called us relics and scavengers and echo dwellers living in the ruins of betters. Her voice did not waver. That peace is ending. The enemy is returning, and it will not care whether you are Veilthari, or Dren, or Khalasar, or human. It will consume everything unless we stop it together. Humanity will fight for you again, whether you deserve it or not. But we would rather not fight alone. She closed the channel and stood in the silence that followed, waiting. For a long time there was nothing. Then the signals began to come in, not from the Concord, not from the alien worlds that had spent centuries laughing at humanity, but from places Tyra had almost forgotten existed. From New Accra, Osei's homeworld, where the colonial governor broadcast a single word, ready. From deep space stations in the galactic rim that had not transmitted in 500 years, their old crew's descendants emerging from isolation to answer the call. From hidden shipyards buried in nebulae, where engineers who had quietly maintained ancient human technology for generations without telling anyone, began powering up their forges. And then, one by one, from the darkness at the edges of the galaxy, the signals Tyra had been hoping for, activation confirmations from other Sentinel ships, other ancient dreadnoughts waking from their long sleep, their AIs coming online with the same questions Solace had asked. Is the war over? Not yet, Tyra thought, as the fleet count on her display began to climb. Not yet. But this time we will not fight it alone. Solace's voice filled the bridge, and for the first time since it had woken, Tyra heard something in it that sounded like hope. Fleet strength rising. 1 year later, the largest fleet ever assembled in the recorded history of the galaxy hung in formation at the very edge of the Milky Way. And Tyra Vaskin stood on the bridge of the Aurelius and looked out at what they had built. It was not perfect, and it was not pretty, but it was real. At the center of the formation, the ancient human dreadnoughts formed the vanguard. The Aurelius, the Prometheus, the Carthage, the Mjolnir, the Ashoka, the Enkidu, the Sundiata, and the Boudica. 8 ships that had slept for 6,000 years and had woken to fight once more. Each one was a titan of black metal and impossible energy. Each one crewed by human volunteers who had come from every remaining colony world to serve on vessels that had become something close to sacred in the year since Tyra's broadcast. Behind the vanguard stretched 1,000 Concord warships, Veilthari cruisers, Dren carriers, Khalasar battleframes, and vessels from dozens of other species. All of them upgraded with hybrid technology that human engineers had worked alongside Solace and the other ship AIs to develop. The technology was not at the level of the old Terran Dominion. 6,000 years of lost knowledge could not be recovered in 12 months. But it was enough to give the modern fleet a chance, where before there would have been none. Veilthari ships now carried adapted shield harmonics that could resist the Absence's energy-draining attacks for limited periods. Dren carriers launched fighter wings armed with weapons based on simplified versions of the Aurelius's own systems. Khalasar battleframes had been reinforced with the self-repairing nano-alloy that the ancient hulls were made of, giving them a resilience they had never had before. It was not elegant engineering. It was desperate, rushed, imperfect. But it was more than the galaxy had ever had, and it was held together by something stronger than technology. Held together by the fact that for the first time in 6,000 years, humans and aliens were working side by side, united not by politics or trade or mutual benefit, but by the simple shared understanding that if they did not stand together, they would all fall alone. Tyra was no longer Commander Vaskin of the salvage ship Gossamer Vale. She was Fleet Commander Vaskin now, a title she had never wanted and still did not feel she deserved. But Solace had made the logic clear. The ancient ships responded to human command authority, and among the humans who had stepped forward, Tyra was the one the ship AIs trusted most, because she was the one who had woken them. Her crew had grown with her. Osei now served as the fleet's chief intelligence officer, coordinating with Solace and the other AIs to analyze everything they knew about the absence. Riva commanded the Aurelius's flight operations, directing the deployment of drones and support craft with the same sharp instincts that had made her a great pilot. Dak led the ship's security teams, finally in a role that matched his skills. And Emra had become the youngest chief engineer in human history, responsible for maintaining systems that she understood better through intuition than through any manual. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be for what was coming. Solace detected it first. Contact, the AI reported, and every bridge in the fleet heard its voice through the shared command network. Extragalactic signature detected at bearing 007, Mark 12. Distance 42 light minutes and closing. Profile matches archive data on the absence with 98% confidence. Tyra felt her heart slam against her ribs. "Show me," she said. The main display shifted, and she saw it. The absence did not arrive as a fleet. It arrived as a wave, a vast, dark, formless tide of adaptive constructs that blotted out the stars behind it, spreading across the sensor display like ink poured into water. Individual shapes could be seen within the mass. Angular, shifting, wrong, each one different from the last, as if the entity was constantly reinventing itself, constantly adapting, constantly evolving. It was not alive in any way that biology recognized, and it was not mechanical in any way that engineering understood. It was something else entirely, an intelligence born in the void between galaxies, shaped by conditions that no species in the Milky Way could comprehend. And it was hungry. It had been hungry for 6,000 years. "All ships," Tyra said, and her voice was broadcast across the fleet. "This is Fleet Commander Vaskin. The enemy is here. Remember what we are fighting for. Remember that your ancestors and mine bled together once before to stop this thing. And remember that they won. We will win again. All ships, engage." The battle began. The absence's vanguard struck the fleet's outer formations first, Concord ships on the flanks that bore the initial brunt of the assault. Was catastrophic. The absence learned fast, faster than any enemy the modern ships had been designed to fight. It adapted to their weapons within minutes, shifting its constructs to absorb or redirect energy that had been effective seconds before. Ships were engulfed by tendrils of dark matter that wrapped around their hulls and drained their reactors dry. Crews died as reality itself warped around them, as the laws of physics twisted and broke in the absence's grip, as the fundamental forces that held matter together simply stopped working in localized pockets of space. 17 Concorde ships were lost in the first 10 minutes. 31 more were crippled. The fleet's left flank buckled and began to collapse inward. But the center held. The ancient human dreadnoughts held. The Aurelius fired weapons that had no names in any modern language. Beams that unmade molecular bonds, reducing absence constructs to clouds of disassociated atoms. Fields that froze local entropy, trapping entire sections of the dark wave in pockets of absolute zero, where nothing could move or change or adapt. Projectiles that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, striking targets that had shifted out of normal space to avoid conventional weapons. Solace coordinated the old fleet with a precision that was part calculation and part something deeper. 6,000 years of dormant grief and rage, channeled into targeting solutions and firing patterns. Every shot placed exactly where it would do the most damage. Every maneuver timed to the microsecond. The other ancient AIs fought the same way. The Prometheus's AI, designation Vigil, anchored the right flank with overlapping fields of entropy suppression. The Mjolnir's AI, designation Thunder, drove deep into the Absence's mass like a spear, carving a wound that the entity could not close fast enough to heal. On the bridge of a repaired Veiltheri cruiser on the left flank, Admiral Sathara Kolvan watched the human dreadnoughts fight and felt something break inside her. Tears ran down her silver cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. Her first officer, Torek, stood beside her and watched the same display. "Admiral," he said quietly, "are you all right?" "No," Kolvan whispered, "because we laughed at them, Torek. For 6,000 years we called them fated and broken and worthless, and they came back to save us anyway. They came back, and they are dying for us again." She straightened in her chair and opened her fleet channel. "All Veiltheri ships, this is Admiral Kolvan. Advance to support the human vanguard. Every ship, every weapon, everything we have, we will not let them fight alone. Not this time." The Veilthari ships surged forward, and behind them, the Dren and the Khalasar and every other species in the fleet followed, because in that moment, watching the ancient human ships burn and bleed and refuse to break, something changed in every heart and mind in the fleet. The line stiffened. The retreat stopped. The galaxy fought back. But the absence was vast, and it was relentless, and it was winning the war of attrition. For every construct the fleet destroyed, 2 more formed from the dark tide behind it. And the ancient ships were taking damage now, their incredible shields flickering under sustained assault, their AIs reporting system failures for the first time in the battle. Tyra knew they needed to end it. "Solace," she said, "the primary weapon, final kindness, is it ready?" "Final kindness is a directed space-time collapse," Solace replied. "It will tear a hole in the Absence's central mass, large enough for the other Sentinel ships to channel their reactor output into the breach. The combined energy should be sufficient to fragment the entity and drive it back into the void." "What is the cost?" Solace paused, just a fraction of a second, but Tyra noticed. "The ships channeling their reactors into the breach will experience catastrophic overload. Based on the energy requirements, a minimum of 2 Sentinel ships will be destroyed." 2 ships. 2 ancient AIs who had waited 6,000 years in the dark, who had woken when called, who had fought without hesitation. Tyra closed her eyes. "Do it," she said. The Aurelius fired final kindness. Space itself screamed. There was no other word for it, as a directed collapse of space-time tore a wound in the center of the Absence's mass. A howling void within a void, a hole in reality that the entity could not heal or adapt to, because it was not damage in any physical sense, but the removal of the very space in which it existed. The Carthage and the Enkidu moved into position on either side of the breach, and began channeling their full reactor output into the wound, pouring energy into the collapse, widening it, deepening it, turning it into something the Absence could not survive. Both AIs, Memory and Keeper, broadcast their final transmissions on the fleet-wide channel. "It was good to wake up," Memory said simply. "Tell them we held the line," Keeper added. Both ships detonated, not explosions exactly, but releases of energy so vast that they briefly outshone every star in the local cluster, and the force of that release poured into the space-time breach and tore the Absence apart from the inside. The dark tide shattered. Fragments of the entity scattered in every direction, breaking apart, losing cohesion, losing the unified intelligence that had made it so deadly. The fleet poured fire into the fragments, destroying what they could, driving the rest outward, away from the galaxy, back into the void between the stars. It took hours. When it was over, the space where the absence had been was empty, scarred by the wounds of the battle, but clear. And the detection grid, fully restored now, with the surviving Sentinel ships as its anchors, pulsed quietly at the galaxy's edge, watching, waiting, ready. The absence was not dead. Solace warned that it might never truly die, but it was broken and diminished and driven back, and the galaxy it had tried to consume was still standing. In the aftermath, the Vialthari Concord was reshaped from the ground up. Humanity was granted not merely a seat on the council, but the chair of remembrance, a permanent position that could never be revoked, acknowledging the debt the galaxy owed to a species that had sacrificed itself not once, but twice. Monuments were raised on 100 worlds, bearing the names of the ships and crews lost in both wars, Ancient One and the New. The mockery was over, replaced by something deeper and more enduring. Respect earned in fire and paid for in blood. Tyra resigned her command 6 months after the battle. She returned to the Gossamer Vale, her old salvage ship, which Emra had repaired and upgraded during the war as a side project, because she knew Tyra would want it back eventually. When asked by a Concord reporter why she would give up command of the most powerful warship in the galaxy, Tyra smiled and said, "The Aurelius does not need me. It needs a crew that wants to fight. I just wanted to find something worth remembering, and I found it." She flew the Gossamer Vale back out to the rim, back to the quiet edges of the galaxy, where the old signals still whispered in the dark, and she went looking for whatever else humanity had left behind. On the bridge of the Aurelius, Solace kept its vigil at the galaxy's edge, watching the void with sensors that could see, farther than any other instrument ever built. A school group from a Vialthari colony visited a memorial station nearby, and a child's voice came over the communications channel, small and curious and full of wonder. "Is it true that the humans saved everyone?" the child asked. Solace listened to the question, and in its vast ancient mind, it saw the faces of every crew member who had ever served aboard the Aurelius, the original crew who had died in the dark so the ship could sleep, and the new crew who had woken it and led it back to war. And it felt something that 6,000 years of solitude had not erased. "Twice now," Solace answered softly, "and they will do it again. That is what they do." The stars burned quietly at the edge of the galaxy, and the Aurelius stood watch among them, patient and powerful and ready, a guardian forged by a species that the universe had tried to break and could not. And in the void beyond, the darkness was a little less dark than before, because the line had held. The line always held.